probably wondering why you have not been set the typical caboodle quizzes that I've been setting for the last few weeks. And the reason for that is we're now reaching our 11th, I want to say 11th, might be wrong, our 11th week of homeschooling, so where schools have been closed. And what we're looking to do now as a whole school is just to provide a bit more structure and a bit more of a home learning experience that would replicate the classroom a bit more. So the way this is going to work is you should recognise some things on the first screen already. Now the idea is I'm going to use the same PowerPoint templates that I would use in the classroom, so you should recognise them. And you will have already noticed that you will recognise your first activity, which is a challenge grid. Because I know, there's probably many things that you're happy about not being at school, but one thing that I think you probably miss the most are my challenge grids. So there's an opportunity there for you to just get back into the swing of things with them. But on a bit more of a serious note, I really do recommend that you sort of complete these challenge grids correctly, because with home learning, there is a risk of your learning becoming a bit more on the back burner, which is completely understandable in the current climate. And what challenge grids are quite good at is just keeping you sort of ticked over. They don't require you to spend hours writing or thinking that hard. They're just short, sharp questions, and you just complete the answers as best you can and then mark them. So just to explain exactly how this is going to work. So what I'm going to be setting from now until whenever we go back is these PowerPoints, which will have these sort of sound bites in. So I'm going to record the audio for you, and then you're going to go through these PowerPoints, listen to my boring voice, and that's going to be sort of our sessions on a weekly basis. So in general terms, what I'm going to be setting are these PowerPoints, and they'll have lots of information, lots of subject knowledge for you, but they will also have lots of mini tasks. So this challenge grid is the first of your mini tasks. And when I say mini tasks, that's what I mean by you are going to complete them to the best of your ability, and then at the end of the PowerPoint, you will have the answers to those mini tasks. So with the mini tasks, what I want you to be doing is completing them and marking them yourself. It's an opportunity for you to check your learning. Now, as well as the mini tasks within the PowerPoint, what will also accompany this PowerPoint on Show My Homework is a link to a final assessment, not assessment, but a final piece of work, and that is the piece of work that I expect you to submit. Now, I've tried to keep it as interactive as possible, so this week it will be a Kahoot quiz. It will be slightly different to what you're used to with Kahoot, as in a classroom going mad. What Kahoot have done quite nicely in this current climate with coronavirus and the closure of schools is they've opened up an opportunity for you to complete a Kahoot quiz at your own pace, whenever you want within the week. So I've set the deadline for Sunday, so you can complete at any point from Monday to Sunday. So that's your final assessed piece of work, and that's what you'll submit, and then I will give you feedback on that. So all I want you to do now is go through this PowerPoint, complete the mini tasks to the best of your ability and mark them, green pen them, however you want to do it. Listen to my boring voice, giving you as much information as I can. And then once you've done that, go over to the Kahoot quiz and complete that to the best of your ability, at which point the following week I'll be providing feedback. Okay, so one of the early units in the biology GCSE curriculum is organisation. So we've already looked at cell biology and what goes into a cell, and now we want to look at organisation. So we want to sort of lift our head up from that a little bit. So what I mean by that is cells are very small, and we're talking about very, very small units. Now we want to try and look at the body as a whole. And this week what we're going to look at is the circulatory system. So we're going to look at the blood, we're going to look at the heart, and we're going to look at how blood is transported around the body, and then finally, to finish off, we're going to look at what happens when the heart or issues occur in the circulatory system, or what happens when the heart goes wrong. So just very quickly, before we get into the nitty-gritty bits of that, what I want to just run through are the very, very basic principles of organisation. So what I mean by that is it's important that when we think of organisation within our body, or this could be any organism for that matter, we need to think about how they can be categorised. So let's, just because it's the most relevant, and let's think about the human body, and let's use that as an example. So you can see on the screen we've got 5 principles of organisation, we've got 5 categories. So from the largest, we have the category of the organism. Now in our example, humans would be the organism. The human as a whole would be the organism. And then if we look a little bit deeper into that, we then have organ systems. So we have the digestive system, we have the circulatory system, we have the reproductive system, and all these are just a group of organs that are working together to perform a specific function. So then from that, if we're looking at a group of organs, you're then thinking, well, what's an organ? So an organ is a group of tissues that work together to perform a specific function. So an example of that could be the heart, it could be the stomach, eyes are an organ, skin is in fact an organ. So in terms of tissues, what we're talking about is a group of similar cells. So they're specialised cells and they are all similar to each other and they all aim to carry out a specific function. So they all share the same structure and the aim of that is to carry out the same function. So examples, and the example on the bottom of your screen there, the tissue is the cardiac muscle tissue. So the tissue that makes up the heart, which is the organ, is made up mostly of cardiac muscle tissue. That's a very specialised tissue made up of very specialised cells. And then lastly, you can see there we've got the cell, which is the smallest structural and functional unit of an organism. And that's a very important definition because we know from the cell biology unit that we can actually get deeper and we can look at things smaller than a cell. So we can look at the nucleus, we can look at the mitochondria, we can look at the ribosomes. However, the cell is the smallest structural and functional unit of an organism. If you were to take the nucleus out of the cell and just have it on its own, it would not be able to function. It wouldn't be able to carry out any role. If you just took the ribosome or the mitochondria out of the cell and had it on its own, it wouldn't be able to function. So now what we do is we combine all of those subcellular structures, so the nucleus, the ribosome, the mitochondria, and we encapsulate them into a cell membrane. So we have a cell, and with all those things combined, we then have a structural and functional unit. So it carries out a job. So it's always good to think about these principles of organisation when we're thinking about the human body as a whole or any organism. And also it is worth thinking that we could go lower than this. So if you wanted to extend yourself here, and we could go smaller. So if you were thinking about DNA, how would you get from a cell to a DNA? Well, you'd go from the cell, and then you would go to the nucleus. And then within the nucleus you have chromosomes. And then within the chromosomes you have genes, which are sections of DNA. And then you have the DNA polymer itself. And then you could even take apart the DNA itself. And if you think of the DNA as the double helix shape of DNA is like a spiral ladder. If you were to unravel that and you were look at each individual rung of the ladder, you would notice what we call nucleotides. So each individual rung is something called a nucleotide. And they carry out very important roles, and the order in which they're in terms of their DNA is very important for the proteins that are produced from DNA. But more on that when we get into year 10. For now, we just want to get comfortable understanding the order in which we get from a cell all the way up to an organism. So to start off with, in circulatory system, we'll look at the blood. So if you were to look at the blood, you would notice that it's actually made up of 4 components. So the blood is what is flowing through all of our arteries, veins, and capillaries. And if we were to open them up, we would notice 4 different components. So if you look at the diagram in this picture of the test tube, and you notice that each of those components have actually been separated. So this is actually possible. So although this is just a diagram, it is possible to actually do this. And it's we do this using a machine called a centrifuge. And what it does is it spins the sample of blood around very, very quickly. So quickly that it actually separates the components by their size. So the heavier components will drop to the bottom because of the G-force. So the heavier components drop to the bottom and the lighter components move to the top. And it's very similar to if you've ever gone to the fair and you've been on that ride, the circular ride that you stand in. It spins around very quickly and it pushes, the G-force pushes you against the wall. That is the exact same process. So the 4 components that we have in the blood is we have the plasma, which is at the top there. It's that yellowy straw-like fluid. And this is actually the only fluid part of the blood. All the other parts of the blood are actually structural cells or fragments of cells. This is the only component that is actually fluid. So the plasma, its main job really is just to transport everything else. So you've got the red blood cells, you've got the white blood cells and the platelets. So for them to move through the body, we need to have a medium in which they flow through, and that's the plasma. So as well as that, they also transport carbon dioxide. So the plasma is where you're going to find the carbon dioxide. And any hormones and any waste products are going to be transported in the plasma. The red blood cells, so 45% of your blood is made up of red blood cells, and these have one job, and one job only, and that's to transport oxygen. That is it. Nothing else. The red blood cell does nothing else other than transport oxygen, and it is designed to do that perfectly. So red blood cells, mature red blood cells, so when they are fully developed, they actually have no nucleus. And if you get rid of the nucleus, which is the largest subcellular structure, then you actually have a lot more room to carry oxygen. It contains a red pigment called hemoglobin, and that is a pigment that actually binds to the oxygen. So in the middle of hemoglobin, we have a iron atom. So that's why sort of anemia and that's low iron, because blood holds a lot of iron. So in the middle of a hemoglobin molecule, you'll find an iron, and then off that you'll find proteins, and they can hold 4 oxygen molecules. So what we're saying there is one hemoglobin molecule can actually hold 4 oxygens. And lastly, they have a biconcaved shape. So they're sort of like a donut that didn't make it all the way through. And what that allows for is a large surface area to volume ratio, which again increases the diffusion of oxygen. So it means we can obtain more oxygen faster. So thirdly, we have our white blood cells, and our white blood cells are all part of our immune system. So the white blood cells, there are actually 5 main types, but you don't need to know about them until you get to A level. What we need to know at GCSE is that white blood cells are part of our immune system. So they fight off any infections, any foreign bodies that are found in our bodies. It's the white blood cells that control that. So white blood cells, they can produce antibodies, which are proteins that have the ability to recognize foreign pathogens and basically tell other white blood cells to destroy them. And what some other white blood cells, what they have the ability to do is to engulf any foreign bodies. They're able to engulf them, digest them, and then get rid of them. So white blood cells are very important for our immune response. Lastly, we have our platelets, and these are tiny fragments of old cells. So they're not actually metabolizing cells, but they clot the blood. They form sort of plugs if you were to cut yourself. So when you cut yourself and then you end up forming a scab, that's your platelets that you have to thank for that. And there's actually a condition called haemophilia, and this is when people lack platelets, so they lack the ability to clot their blood. And in severe cases, a simple paper cut would actually cause this patient to bleed out. And haemophilia is a brilliant word in biology because it shows examples of how we can break down words. So if you look at the word haemophilia, heme comes from the Latin of bleed or blood, so heme meaning blood, and if I asked you what philia meant, or where in any other words have you seen the word philia, then you can probably think of some dynamic examples, but philia actually means to love. So what the word actually translates to is to love to bleed. And that kind of makes sense because haemophiliacs, it's very difficult to get them to stop bleeding because they lack these platelets. So you don't necessarily need to know about haemophilia, but you do need to know that platelets clot the blood and they stop us from bleeding. So we've spoken about the blood and what makes up the blood. So now we need to think about how the blood is transported around the body. And this is done in the blood vessels. Now we have three main blood vessels that we want to talk about. We have the arteries, we have the veins, and we have the capillaries. And there's a diagram on the slide there to just describe, just to illustrate them through. So the arteries carry blood away from the heart. If it helps to think, arteries begins with an A. We're carrying blood away from the heart. So they carry blood at very high pressure. So to be able to maintain this, they have very thick muscular walls and they have a small lumen. The lumen is essentially just the hollow hole that flows through the tube. That's all the lumen is. So where the blood actually flows, that's the lumen. And you can see that in the artery, that's actually relatively small compared to the size of the artery itself. And that's because most of the artery is made up of muscular tissue with a small bit of elastic connective tissue on the outer layer. So because it's very thick muscular tissue, it means that that pushes against the blood and it maintains that very high pressure. This is as opposed to the veins. So the veins carry blood to the heart. So the arteries are going away from the heart, veins are coming back to the heart, and the veins have very thin walls. And their thin walls mean that they have a large lumen. So these two things combined means that they actually carry blood at a rather low pressure. Now, when you're carrying blood at high pressure, you haven't really got to worry about it getting to its destination because it's at high pressure, it's going to get there. However, when we're at low pressure, we're now worrying about how we get blood back to the heart. If there's not a lot of pressure pushing it in that direction, how do we get it there? And especially when you think maybe about the veins in the legs, which have now got to work against gravity, that makes that question sort of more difficult. So there's a couple of features of the veins that actually allow blood to be flowing in the right direction. The first one is that the veins have one-way valves. So you only find these in the veins, you don't find them in the arteries or the capillaries. And these one-way valves do exactly what they say on the tin. They only allow blood to flow in one direction. So as blood flows through that valve, if blood was to sort of drop in pressure massively and start to flow back, it wouldn't be able to because the valves would stop it. And as well as this, not always, but most of the veins are found in areas that are sat between muscles. So especially when you think about our legs, so the prime example is the veins that run through our upper legs are sat between our quadricep muscles. So our quadricep muscles, think of the word quad, are actually made up of 4 individual muscles, and you will find veins sat between them. Now the good thing here is that as you walk, your muscles of your legs contract and relax, contract and relax. And what this allows to happen is that as they contract, they will squeeze against the vein, which then pushes the blood further up the vein, again going back towards the heart. So the veins are carrying blood towards the heart, and they have 2 features to allow this to happen. They have the one-way valves, and they have the fact that they are situated mostly, but not always, between muscles. So as the muscles contract, they will squeeze the blood in the right direction. Lastly, we have the capillaries. Now, the capillaries essentially just connect the arteries to the veins. The capillaries are 1 cell thick, so they're very, very thin, and they only allow 1 cell through at a time. So they think of all the cells of all the red blood cells of the blood sort of lined up in a queue going through the capillaries. The blood is carried at very, very low pressure here, and that's because the capillaries are going to be the site of any exchange. So if you're thinking about oxygen going to a muscle, then the oxygen is only ever going to leave the blood vessel through the capillary. Carbon dioxide coming into the blood to be taken to the lungs, that again will only ever take place through a capillary. So capillaries are the main site of any exchange of materials. Lastly, what's worth mentioning, and this leads me nicely onto the next slide when we talk about the heart, is that arteries typically carry oxygenated blood because they're typically carrying blood away from the heart to the body. There is one exception to that rule, and that's with the pulmonary artery. Because remember, we've got to pump blood from the heart to the lungs to get oxygenated, and the blood vessel that does that is the pulmonary artery. And again, same principle, but the opposite is that we have all veins that carry deoxygenated blood. So it's safe to assume that most veins carry deoxygenated blood, except for one vein, which is the pulmonary vein, which is carrying oxygenated blood from the lungs to the heart. So arteries always carry blood away, veins always carry blood towards the heart. However, it's not always safe to say that, all arteries carry oxygenated blood, because there's one very big exception to that rule, and the same with the veins. So now we're going to look at the heart. So the heart essentially is just one big muscle, and its main role is to simply pump blood around the body. It's the main site, as I say, it's that big muscle, and that muscle allows it to send blood around the body. Now, the heart is made up of four main chambers. We have the left and right atrium, and we have the left and right ventricle. So it's very important to learn about the flow of blood through the heart. Now, to do this, I've given you two diagrams. I personally prefer the diagram on the left, but I'm also aware that the picture on the right shows a bit more of a logical sequence, so that might be easier to understand. So I've given you both because I do feel like some of you will prefer the diagram on the left, some of you prefer the diagram on the right. So it's important to know the structures, and then once we know the structures, to then understand how blood flows around the heart. So if we think of deoxygenated blood coming back to the heart from the body, if we start there, technically it's just a full cycle, so we could start anywhere, but we'll start at the deoxygenated blood from the body. That's going to arrive from the vena cava, so that will be the superior if it's above the heart, and inferior if it's from below the heart. So it's going to come from the vena cava, and it's going to flow into the right atrium. From the right atrium, this is all deoxygenated blood, so all the oxygen's left the blood, and that from the right atrium it's going to be pumped into the right ventricle, and then from there it's going to flow through a valve, and it's going to go into the pulmonary artery, where that blood is going to flow away, because it's an artery, it's going to flow away from the heart to the lungs to get oxygen. Once it's collected the oxygen from the lungs, it's going to flow in the pulmonary vein because it's coming towards the heart. It's going to flow towards the heart in the pulmonary vein into the left atrium. From the left atrium, it will go into the left ventricle, and the left ventricle, you'll notice, has the thickest walls. And this is because it needs the most power, because it needs to then pump blood out of the aorta, the blood vessel which is an artery, the aorta, and that sends it around the body to then oxygenate all the cells in the body. So this flow of blood through the heart is very important to understand. And also what you may have noticed, and you may be slightly confused about, is the diagram on the left, at the top left of that picture, the right and the left seem to be the wrong way round. And that's because whenever we talk about the heart, we always talk about it in place, so in situ, in our body. So if you think about your heart in your body, the left atrium and the left ventricle are going to be on the left side. So when we look at it on a diagram, it's always reversed. So the flow of the heart and those structures that I've mentioned there, and all the structures that you see in the diagrams, are structures that you want to become familiar with. As well as that, there's a couple of other things to go through in terms of the heart. So we can describe the circulatory system as a double circulatory system. And essentially what that means is that in one contraction, so in one heartbeat, blood is transported in two directions. You have, in one contraction, you have blood leaving the left ventricle and going to the body. And in that same contraction, you have blood leaving the right ventricle and going to the lungs. So it's a double circulatory system because in each contraction, you've got blood going in two directions. As opposed to, for example, a fish, which has a single circulatory system. In one contraction, blood goes to the gills to get oxygenated, then again it flows to the body, then back to the heart. So that's a single circulatory system. As well as that, and I'll get onto this in the next couple of slides, but it's always worth remembering that the heart is a muscle, and being a muscle, it also needs oxygen. So the arteries that supply the heart with oxygen are called the coronary arteries. So that comes from the aorta, so it comes from the left ventricle and comes out of the aorta and wraps around the heart, and those coronary arteries are what supply the heart itself with oxygen. And the last point is what we call our pacemaker cells. Now these are actually neuronal cells, so they're technically part of the nervous system, but they are part of the cardiac system and all. So the job of the pacemaker cells are to keep the rhythm. So they ensure that the heart maintains the rhythm and maintains the beat that we're used to. Any failure in the pacemaker cells can lead to an irregular heartbeat, which can lead to later complications. And you will have heard of artificial electrical pacemakers, which are used if that's a common occurrence. So pacemaker cells just sit there waiting for an irregular heartbeat, and then they correct the heart if needed. Okay, so this is your first sort of mini task, or well, second, sorry, with the challenge grid. So with this match-up task, all I want you to do is match the definitions, or sorry, the keywords to either the definitions or the words or the statements that best describe those keywords. So if you are working from the PowerPoint, you could do this by just going to insert shapes and just inserting lines to match them up just like you would with a ruler and a pencil or a pen. Or if you're watching this on YouTube, then you can either copy them out into the right order. So you can make a little table yourself, but make sure that the correct key term is aligned with the correct statement. I'm not overly fussed the way in which you do this, and as I say again, you will be green penning this at the bottom of the PowerPoint. You will find the opportunity to green pen them. So, as I mentioned with the slide that was discussing the heart, I did mention the coronary arteries. And the reason for that is because it leads into what we're going to look at now, which is what happens when the heart goes wrong. So if there's ever any issues with the heart, we're going to look at what those issues could be, why they're caused, and how we can treat them. So the first one is coronary heart disease, and one of the main causes of that is a condition called atherosclerosis. And all this is essentially a build-up of fatty tissue in the coronary arteries. So you can see from the diagram that the top one is a normal artery with blood flowing through it nicely. And then you can see in the next two arteries, you can see a build-up of cholesterol or fatty tissue in those arteries. Now, it's quite obvious to think, well, the issue with that is it's going to limit blood flow. If there's something blocking it, blood's not going to be able to get through. But we need to think a little bit deeper about that and think, well, what does that mean? Okay, so the heart is a muscle, and a muscle requires energy. How do we get energy in our body? Well, that's respiration. So respiration is how we obtain our energy in our body. And respiration, if you think of the respiration equation, it's glucose plus oxygen gives us carbon dioxide and water. So oxygen is a key feature of respiration. Now, if oxygen is not getting to the muscle cells of the heart, then it's not going to be able to undergo respiration, which means we're going to be limiting the amount of energy that those muscle cells have, which means we're going to start having issues with our heart. In severe cases, and if left untreated, then this will lead to a heart attack. So treatment options need to be taken quickly. As well as that, you'll see at the bottom right of the screen, we have risk factors for coronary heart disease. Now, all a risk factor is something that will increase your risk of getting that disorder or condition or infection. So risk factors can be applied to anything in disease. So the main risk factors for coronary heart disease are smoking, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, so that's typically in your diet, so if you eat a lot of fatty foods, and not enough exercise. What isn't in that list, and probably should be, is your hereditary links. So coronary heart disease, there is a strong genetic link with that. So if coronary heart disease runs in your family, then you are at increased risk, and you need to be monitored maybe more than the next person. So this is what coronary heart disease is. We're looking at atherosclerosis here, and the next slide we're going to look at the different treatment options for this. So coronary heart disease, as we know, is caused by atherosclerosis, and it's a build-up of that fatty tissue. So we've got two ways in which we treat this. Firstly, we have statins. So statins is on the right side of that screen, and statins are a pharmaceutical drug, and what they do is they stop the natural production of cholesterol from your liver. So cholesterol and that type of fatty tissue is completely normal, and we actually need it to a certain extent. So all of our cell membranes are made up of a lipid bilayer that comes from this fatty tissue. So we do need this fatty tissue, but it's when it's in excess that it becomes an issue and coronary heart disease becomes likely to occur. So what statins do is they slow down the production of natural cholesterol in a hope to limit the amount of cholesterol in your body, which in turn hopefully reduces the rate in which those sort of fatty deposits form in the arteries. So statins are used typically in very early cases of coronary heart disease, and arguably they're actually a preventative treatment in the hope that we don't get to a point where we need something more invasive. So taking a drug, once a day is much more of a preferred option than the other treatment option, which is something called a cardiac stent. So this is on the left-hand side of the screen. So a cardiac stent is a small metal mesh cylinder that is actually inserted in your groin. So it's inserted in the femoral artery in your groin, and they move, so with a small tube, they transport the mesh all the way through the artery into your coronary arteries, and then they blow up a balloon which has the mesh around it. That mesh inflates and pushes against the artery, pushing against that fatty tissue, and then as they take the tube away, they deflate the balloon, take the tube away, that mesh cylinder is left behind, and it's essentially propping up the artery. So it's just a method used to widen the artery to allow oxygen to flow through, to allow the red blood cells to flow through. So you would rather not have a stent because it's much more of an invasive procedure. As I say, it's surgery. We would much rather have statins, but if we reach a point where statins are no longer going to be effective, then a stent will be required. So we've looked at one main issue that can occur within the heart, and that's coronary heart disease. The second one we're going to look at is a faulty heart valve. So I haven't really mentioned the valves in the heart so much at the moment, or so much in the session, because you don't actually need to remember the names of the valves precisely. But what you do need to know is within the heart, you're going to find four valves, one between the atriums and the ventricles, and one between the ventricles and the outgoing arteries. So you don't need to know the names of these, All you need to know is that they ensure that blood is flowing in the right direction. Now, a faulty heart valve, funnily enough, is when that goes wrong and blood is leaking back into the area in which it just tried to leave. So this can be an issue because it's going to limit the amount of blood flow being used and utilised, and it's going to disrupt the rhythm within the heart. So we've got two main types of heart valves that we need to be aware of. We have biological and we have mechanical. Now this is a very common 6-mark question, and you'll notice on the next slide I'm going to ask you to have a go at one of these, but essentially in general a biological heart valve is going to last slightly less time than the mechanical, but it's going to have a less chance of an immune rejection. Now what I mean by immune rejection is your immune response, so your immune system is very good at detecting things in your body that shouldn't be there. So for example, whether that be a bacteria, a virus, protist, any form of infection, anything like that, your immune system is very good at detecting it. Now, what your immune system isn't quite clever enough to know is that when we insert an artificial or a replacement heart valve into your heart, the immune system doesn't necessarily realise that we're doing that for your benefit. So the immune system might look at this new replacement valve and think, well, that's a foreign body, that's not part of me, I'm going to attack that because I think I need to get rid of it. So the biological, because it's biological, they actually typically stem from the heart valves from cows. So because of that, there's less chance of our immune system looking at that, rejecting it and trying to get rid of it. So that's in comparison to the mechanical heart valve. So a mechanical heart valve is typically made of titanium and acrylic, and these will last a lot longer. However, there is that increased risk of immune response because a chunk of titanium in the middle of your heart typically definitely should not be there. However, in this case, you may need it. So if immune rejection is a strong possibility, then you may be prescribed a drug called immunosuppressants, and they do exactly what they say on the tin. They suppress your immune system, so they try to limit any chance of rejection so that the valve can carry out its typical job. So on the next slide, I won't put a soundbite on the next slide, but on the next slide you will see a typical 6-mark question. So you've got lots of information. You've got a table giving you information on the biological valve and the mechanical valve, and you are asked to compare and evaluate the use of these. So to compare and evaluate, you need to discuss both valves against each other, which one's better than the other. So I've given you 2 there. So the biological is going to have less chance of immune rejection, but the mechanical will last longer. So you need to be discussing that in your answer. And then again, at the end of the PowerPoint, you have your mark scheme. So I want you to mark your 6-mark question against that mark scheme. The last issue that we're going to discuss in terms of the heart is heart failure. Now, heart failure is when we reach a point with the heart in which the heart can now no longer carry out its job and it needs replacement. So what we most typically talk about here is a heart transplant. Now, heart transplants are up there with the most carrying the highest risk in terms of surgery. So what we have here is the ability to remove the failed heart or the failing heart, remove the failing heart from the body and replace it with a donor heart. Now, there's quite a few complications that can come with this. Firstly, the surgery itself is incredibly risky. Secondly, we have the issue of finding a donor heart. So recently, the legislation in this country has just changed that when you hit 18 or when you apply for your provisional driving licence, what used to happen is that you would then get the option to become a donor. And to become an organ donor, you would have to apply for that. So you would have to contact the government or public health and say, I am willing to donate my organs, and specify which organs they are. The legislation has recently just changed to say that you have to opt out of that. So now the government are going to assume that you are willing to donate your organs unless you tell them otherwise. Now, the reason that was implemented is because it is very difficult to get donor hearts. Funnily enough, donated hearts, you can't just pick them up everywhere. Now, the other reason why it's very difficult to get a donor heart, it stems back to the conversation on heart valves. So, we know that, or you may be aware that you have certain blood types and certain blood groups. So these are A, B, positive and negative, and O group. So for your donor heart to be accepted by your heart, or by your body, then they have to be what they call a body tissue match, which means typically your blood group has to be the same to ensure there's no reaction, and there's a few other key markers that have to match up. Now that means that it's very difficult. You have to be very lucky to have someone recently die, their heart be in a good enough condition for transplant, and they be a tissue match for you. That's quite a rare occasion. That's quite rare that happens. So this is why heart transplants are rarely conducted, and they're very difficult to conduct. Now, also what we need to mention is artificial hearts. So artificial hearts are very, very rare. Now, artificial hearts are only used when a patient is waiting for a heart transplant, and they're only used when their own heart will physically not sustain life anymore. So this will typically be used if, for example, a patient is near a very top of a transplant list and maybe a heart is likely to appear in the near future. What we don't want is their own heart to give out and that patient die, and then a heart become available for them, a week or a month later. So we may attach them to an artificial heart, which is a machine that sits next to the bed, and it connects to all the blood vessels of the heart, and it essentially carries out the job of the heart for you. Now with this, there's massive risk of having an artificial heart, and as well as this, you're also bedbound during this whole process. So this is why it's very rare. We often try to get hearts available before the need of an artificial heart, but if it meets the criteria of it might be happening soon and the heart is going to give out before the transplant takes place, then the artificial heart may be fitted.